Hello, my name is Osha. I like to talk about history. Today I'm going to be discussing ancient Middle Eastern civilizations up to the Persians. The Persians and Iranians are synonymous. I've done a video discussing how uh, you know Persia as a nation changed to Iran and then back again and forth. I've done a video explaining that, discussing that. This happened in 1935, and of course, it's ancient Greeks and English-speaking people in the West that normally refer to um, Iranians as Persians, right? Since the time of Cyrus the Great, the Achaemenid Empire, and of course, but people within Iran, people who are Persians or people who live within the Persian empires, refer to themselves internally as Iran, right? Iranians. Again, Iran means land of the Aryans. I'm going to try and do several videos explaining how these terms, are used, sometimes also misused, because even the Nazis, right? The Aryan philosophy, the Aryan racist philosophy they espouse, they're referring to the Aryans, the same Aryans from Iran, in Iran, the Persians, right? Because again, the Persians built the largest population ever the largest empire ever in terms of population, in terms of its control over world population. So the Achaemenid Empire, which is in the Bible, right? That was the empire founded by the Persian king Cyrus the Great, who's referred to in the Bible, including the book of Isaiah, who freed Jewish people from the Babylonian captivity, right? Cyrus the Great. At its height, it controlled roughly 49% of the world's population, or 44 to 49% of the world's population, which was about 110 to 112 million people at the time. It is in the Guinness Book of World Records. I don't know if the Guinness Book still functions, but it has a record as, uh, the empire that controlled, that had authority over the largest population of human beings. So it controlled almost half of the world's population, between 44 to 49% of the world's population. That's the largest. Um, so roughly, we're talking about between 50 million to 54 million people, right? Because it controlled, 44 to 49% of the world's population. Now, in terms of land population, land control over territory, though, their territorial extent, it's not the largest empire ever, because of course there were limitations in terms of transportation back then, right? The Achaemenid Empire was founded by Cyrus the Great in 550 BC. BC means before Christ, right? So 550, navy navigation wasn't great then. The British has the record for the largest territorial empire, the largest control over territory, over land in the world, in history. There, the British Empire at its height in 1920 had controlled um, roughly 25 square kilometers of the world's, right, land mass, 25 million square kilometers, right? That was what the British had sovereignty over, right, in terms of um, territorial control. The second, in terms of territorial extent, is the Mongolian Empire, right? Because many people say Genghis Khan's Mongol Empire was the largest and things like that. It was the second to the British, of course, and it was much ancient than the British Empire. So the Mongols had 24 million in square kilometers in territorial extent. And of course, remember the world's population was much lower. Right now, today, we're over 7 billion, 8 billion or so. That's a lot, 8 billion, much more. But back then, in the time of the Achaemenids, the world's population was lower. It was just 110 million approximately. And the Persians, that's the Iranians, Persians, right, the ancestors, they still exist. They controlled half the world's population at that time in within their empire. Half the world's population came under their authority, their sovereignty, under the Achaemenid Empire founded by Cyrus the Great. Um, so I want to talk about empires and civilizations, the development of civilizations, because there's a lot of overlap when we're discussing these ancient civilizations, and I'd like to just give some clarification and just provide some insight as much as I can. When people talk about civilizations, and I know many people, who don't see the distinctions, might tend to contend. For instance, I hear people saying that, well, the oldest civilization was in Africa, right? That Africans, I've seen videos, comedians talk about that, that the oldest civilization was in Africa. No, that's not true. So I was also a biological major, by the way. Yes, I've done a lot of education. I was a biological major, once a biological major at Columbia University, in addition to other things. And of course, I'm a historian. So the National Institutes of Health says humanity first started in Africa. So the first humans came from Africa, right? So that's where all human beings, even Neanderthals, right? I've seen, today people talk about Neanderthals a lot and about how Neanderthals mixed with humans. Um, Neanderthals, of course, they dominated Europe, Central Asia, right? Because they were adapted to hold civilizations. This was around 400,000, right, years ago, and of course they disappeared roughly about 40,000 years ago. But there was some mix, right? They lived at the time that humans, the modern human beings, lived as well. Just for a few thousand years, there was some overlap, and of course, today scientists say that there was even some intermixing, right? Because some humans apparently have Neanderthal DNA, right? So it's speculated that the mixing occurred in the area of the Levant, right? The Levant is the Middle East. That's where Israel, right? Israel, Syria, Jordan, those modern places are located. That area is called Palestine. That area is called the Levant, right? By the right Mediterranean Sea, Red Sea. That area is known as the Levant, right? Um, so Neanderthals, 400,000 years ago, modern humans that we know today, um, came about roughly 100 to 200 to about 200,000 years ago, right? Again, all from Africa, and there's normally that movement out. Even Neanderthals, even though they dominated, lived in Europe 400,000 years ago, again, they also, what scientists say is that they also came from Africa at some point, right? Maybe a million years ago, the Homo erectus, they first develop, right, in Africa. They appear in Africa, and then they move out, right? They tend to move out because humans at that time were hunter gatherers, right? The early hominins, right? That's what you call ancestors of humans, Homo erectus. They're hunter gatherers. They move around, right? Just move around because they didn't have civilization yet. So civilization, when we refer to civilization, let me actually, yeah. So humans were said to have gone into the area of the Levant about 100,000 years ago. So that area of the Middle East, right, where the area where Israel, Palestine, these modern Middle Eastern nations are located. That's a Levant. They're said to have gone there roughly 100,000 years ago, right? Of course, there's that Africa, out of Africa theory, right? That modern humans moved into Central Asia, moved out of Africa around roughly 50 to 70 years ago. So there are these different waves of moving out. But the National Institutes of Health, there's a consensus that this Africa is the sole place where humans came from. It's in Africa, right? And then they move out, right? So that's National Institutes of Health. That's biology, but that's not what I'm talking about when I'm talking about civilization. So civilization, historians, when we say civilization, historians mean the development, the settlement of an area, like urbanization, the development of cities, right? City states that have a centralized form of government, some kind of governance, right? So civilization developed after humans, so humans had started farming, and they had agriculture, advanced agricultural techniques that allowed them to produce surplus, right? They produced a surplus. So because they produced surplus, right, they weren't tied to rural communities anymore, rural areas, to the farmland, and they were able to develop cities, develop technology, right? They developed architecture, ways to get food, storage systems, water. They developed permanent settlements, right? Permanent settlements, and they focused on governing, and there was politics. They were able to focus on other things that we know that human beings and do today. For instance, human beings love leisure, right? They were able to develop leisure, develop writing. So that's what I'm talking about when we say civilization. So historians can go back and look at what humans were doing, the artifacts they created, the architecture they created. So that's civilization, right? The language, the clothes they made, the styles, right? So civilization has culture in it as well. I guess that's the reason why I'm playing music, right? Uh, I've done a video before explaining that this is the theme song from the great Game of Thrones, which I loved so much. The composer is actually a German Iranian. He's Iranian, a German. He was born in Germany. He's an Iranian. His name is Ramin Jawadi, right? He also composed Iron Man, right? Theme song for Iron Man, for people who love, Iron Man, the comics where he composed the theme song for Iron Man as well. So anyway, in any event, back to culture. So I'm talking about civilizations and culture. So during civilizations, they develop language, right? Humans develop language. They develop writing. They develop music. They develop music, style, things like that. Because human society is wealthier now. They have a surplus, right? They don't have to be looking for food daily, subsistence living. So you see, humans. So you see animals, like the lower order animals. So again, in terms of biology, by the way, biology classifies living organisms into plant form and animal forms, and humans just fit animal form. So if you're studying like animals in the kingdom, you notice animals don't create a civilization, right? They're focused on eating, right? How they will gather food and eat, right? So that's not a civilization, right? But humans developed a civilization. They have a civilization. They develop arts. They develop culture. They build houses, things like that. They build houses. They don't live under trees or things like that. So that's civilization. So that's why I'm going to be discussing the civilizations of the Middle East. So the first known civilization actually came from the Middle East, right? The Middle East. It's called the Sumerian form of civilization. It's supposed to be the oldest, the first civilization in the world. Sumerian civilization. It developed around 4,500 years ago. 4,500 BC. Today we're in AD, so this is 2026. We're over 2000 AD, so roughly over 6,500 years ago. That was the first true civilization, right? First true civilization. 6,000, basically over 6,500 years ago, around 7,000 years ago. That's a Sumerian civilization. Where is Sumeria? Sumeria is in the area of modern day Iraq, right? And it overlapped, so the thing about these civilizations, they became empires and they have an overlap, right? So for instance, even though when I talk about the Persian Empire, it's Iranians, their homeland their center, right, their epicenter is in Iran, is in Persia. But you see the Achaemenids who were the Persians, they dominated and conquered other parts of the world as well, because they had authority over half of the world's population, right, roughly 50 million, right, out of the 110 million people living in their times in the 6th century AD. But the Sumerian civilization is in the area of modern day, it's Mesopotamia. Mesopotamia also refers to Iraq, modern day Iraq. So that's where the first civilization developed, roughly 4500 BC. The Sumerians were responsible for many things, right? They gave us writing, the first form of writing, true systematic form of writing, not just using paintings and signs, right? But something systematic, right? You see how we can write speech in words. So a systematic form of writing. We can write what I'm saying. If I say cat, I can write it without having to just draw it, right? But something I can even write tone, there are things I can write without having to paint a picture. So the first systematic form of writing is called the cuneiform writing, right? And it was developed by the Sumerian civilization, and this came about 4,500 years ago. Now, for people interested in the Bible, I'll do another video discussing, because people who like religious, by the way, I'm a Christian, right? By faith, but my Christianity, is has nothing to do with studies in science and maybe objective history, right? So, but we do use the Bible a lot for historical correspondence and reference, right? So historians like to use the Bible a lot because it's supposed to be a work of history, right? But as I'm discussing these things, it has nothing to do with my personal faith, my religion. Now, what I was going to say was that by in terms of religion, it is normally scholars try and establish that the world is 6,000 years ago, right, from the Bible. Sorry, it's about 6,000 years old, right, from the Bible, from Genesis, from their calculations. Now, fortunately, I have friends who are Jewish people. Again, the Bible is, my historian professor used to say, well, the Bible is a codification of Jewish history. So my Jewish friends who know the Talmud well, the Talmud again interprets the Bible and analyzes the Bible, right, and explains it. That's the Hebrew Bible, the Torah. So my Jewish friends that I've discussed with, I was fortunate that I was a Holocaust study fellow at the Institute of Israel and Jewish Studies at Columbia University when I was in school. And so I've also interacted with Jewish people, and I asked people who are of the Jewish faith. And they explained to me that, well, a lot of the Bible is also symbolic, especially the old, from the area of Genesis. It's a complicated book. A lot of it is symbolic. There's a lot of symbolism or allegory in it. And then because, it was such an old time, a long time ago, and it was written a long time ago, that there were, in terms of time, for instance, the word for time, there are no distinctions, and they tend to be conflated. So they explain that, and then that there's allegory in the Bible. So Jewish people are not of the belief, right? They don't believe that the world is just over 6,000 years ago old or 7,000 years ago, right? They will not conflate science, right, scientific evidence, with their religion or what's written in the Bible, right? So this was just something I wanted to just put out. So right now I'm discussing history. I just wanted to clarify that. But I wanted to also go back into something that we have in the Bible. Abraham is supposed to be the origin of the Abrahamic religions. That includes Judaism, which I just mentioned, right? The religion of Jewish people who give us the Torah, and of course Christianity as well, and Islam. They're called the Abrahamic religions. Now, Abraham is supposed to have come from Ur of the Chaldeans, right? Ur of the Chaldeans, which is in the Bible. Ur of the Chaldeans is was one of the states of the Sumerians, right? The Sumerians. So there was Ur, there was Uruk, and there was Lagash, right? So these were cities, developed cities in within the Sumerian civilization in the area today that's Mesopotamia or Iraq, modern day Iraq. So that's where Abraham, right, is supposed to have come from. Now, Abraham was supposed to have lived about roughly 2100 years before Christ, between 2100 years to 1800 years, right, before Christ. So 2100 BC. Around this time, again, the biggest civilization, the first civilization was the Sumerian civilization 4,500 years ago. And that's where Abraham was supposed to have left, right? He left Ur of the Chaldeans and moved out was going into the area of the Levant, right? Seeking out Canaan, which is in somewhere around Palestine, right? Seeking out Canaan, and he was moving out from Ur of the Chaldeans in the area of, modern day Iraq, right? Around that time, I know, and there are people who will be contending that, well, I'm focusing on the Middle East. Well, the first true civilization as we know it came from the Middle East, so 4,500 BC. You can look at, there were contemporaries, right? Subsequent contemporaries when it was still standing, right? So the Sumerians, they were still standing in Egypt. Egypt didn't develop in Africa. Egypt developed around 3100 BC, and they also had their own form of writing, right? So Egypt developed in Egypt, got 3100, around 3100 BC. Now, something I also wanted to point out about these civilizations, I talked about agriculture. So agriculture meant prosperity in agriculture meant civilizations were able to come up, right? They were able to arise. So the area where the first civilization came up, the Sumerian civilization, that's in a very fertile crescent between the Tigris River and the Euphrates, right? And these are in the Bible. That's actually the area where the Garden of Eden, right, where Adam and Eve first came up, right? That's supposed to be the cradle where the first man and woman were supposed to have been created, right? Where they were created in the Garden of Eden. It traces it to that area. The Garden of Eden is supposed to have been within that area between the Tigris and the Euphrates River. Many people actually trace it to modern day Turkey. Now, that area of modern day Turkey is also still very significant. I'll do a subsequent video and I'll explain. Many people trace their civilizations, their origin to that area of modern day Turkey. We all know Troy, the Trojans, right? The Romans were supposed to have come from the Trojans. The first patrician Romans were supposed to have migrated with the sack of Troy when the Greeks destroyed Troy, right? And so they left Troy, Anatolia. That area is in the area Troas, right? The area of modern day Turkey. So that all of that is still regarded as the Levant, right? What I was going to say about agriculture and the establishment of these early civilizations was the access to great rivers, right? Great rivers, very fertile areas. So the Iraq, you see, it's between the Levant, the Iraq. This civilization, Sumerian civilization, was by the Tigris and the Euphrates River, right? So it allowed agriculture, farming to prosper, and they could have surplus, and they could develop civilizations. A hallmark of civilization is the ability of human beings not to just be focused on agriculture, on farming, developing food. They can now focus on leisure, developing arts, entertainment, architecture, permanent establishment of a governing body, right? Politics, right? Other forms of work, more sophisticated work, right? Other than farming. So this is what being situated around a great river has helped civilization. So you see the rise of the Egyptian Empire around 3100 BC, right? So it's after the Sumerian civilization first started. Sumerian civilization again started 4500 BC. The Egypt grew around 3100 BC because of the Nile, right? The Nile River, right? I'll just mention my own people like Yorubas, Nigerians, right? We have these great rivers as well. The River Niger, right? The River Niger. Um, it's interesting. River Niger. That's where the name of the country comes from, Nigeria, and I guess the pejorative Niger, nigger, right? That's racist use, right? So it comes from that. So that area, River Niger, that's where, it's in Nigeria, it runs through Nigeria. There's another river, River Benue. Now, people don't study our West African civilizations like, you know, like Middle Eastern, the other ancient and European civilizations are studied. So it's up to us Africans to study and put out, what we know of our civilizations. But there were great civilizations that were developed there as well as the latest 3,500 years ago. Like Yorubas, my culture, they go back to 3,500 years and they have great artifacts. Many of them are in Western museums, right? So, but anyway, back to the Middle Eastern civilization. I just wanted to show that there were other civilizations that were growing in different parts, and these civilizations come up around great rivers, right? Where there are great rivers to help agriculture. And so these civilizations, they developed irrigation and things like that. Now, apart from the Sumerian civilization, what is called um, the first true territorial states came from the Sumerian. So they unified some Sumerian cities, right? Because the Sumerians were known for city states. They weren't a unified empire. They didn't have any one unified empire, right? As we know, the Achaemenids or the Roman empires, later civilizations formed. So the Sumerians had these city states, right? And they were not unified. So the Akkadians, right? The Akkadians were known to have formed the first unified empire, right? The Akkadians. They, again, they developed the Akkadian cuneiform, form of writing. They developed many different things. Sumerians developed, banking, early forms of modern banking, and so many other things as well. So they were known for their art, architecture, and so many different things. Those are again hallmarks of civilization. So the Akkadian Empire came. They arose, the first territorial states. They arose roughly 2,334 BC, right? Around 2,334 BC. That was when the Akkadian Empire arose, unifying the unified Sumerian city-states, right? And they developed the civilization. Remember, these are around Mesopotamia. The Akkadians unified, again, their spillover territories, Iraq, Iran as well, were part of Persia. So there's these spillover territories, Syria, and so many different places. Now, I'm going to continue with another video, and I'll just continue because I'm going to walk us into Iran. But let me finish off with this in terms of language, right? I talked about how the Nazis, right, used Aryans, referring to the Persian Aryans. Again, the Persians were the Aryans, right? Referring to them, drawing a connection with them and the superiority of their race with Persian people, because and referring to these Indo-Europeans, right? Indo-Europeans, Aryans, these groups, and making these racist invectives against Semitic groups, right? That's mainly Jewish people. So we talk about Semitic groups, right? Semitic groups like Jewish, right? If you say you hate Jews, they call you an anti-Semite, right? So that's because Jewish people, Arcadians, they're supposed to be Semitic groups. Those people in Mesopotamia, they're supposed to be Semitic groups, right? Semites. Arabians are supposed to be Semitic groups. Now, are they a race? No, they're not a race. It's used, it's conflated in a pejorative manner today as a race. They're not a race. They're linked by language and culture. So that's, so these people speak a similar language, a related language, right? Arabs, Jewish people, Akkadians, Aramic, Aramic, right? So they speak these a similar related language that's called Semitic, right? It's why is it called Semitic? So historians, when they do things, even biologists, scholars, scientists, anything they study, they give it a name. So they give it a name. They can have their different philosophy, motivation for giving something a name. It was just people who were studying languages in the 19th century, scientists, and they gave these related languages of Arabs, uh, uh, Hebrews, Aramean, and Akkadian. They named them a Semitic group, right? Because of the Bible reference to Shem, right? Remember the children of Noah, because they were mixing their biblical knowledge with the science they were studying at the time. So the Bible says the whole world was destroyed and everybody's descended from Noah. So they named these this language cluster, right? That had Arabs, Jewish, Akkadians were they were related. Aramean, in the area of the Levant, the language seemed similar. They named them Syrians. They named them Semites from Shem, right? Shem, who was the son of Noah, one of the sons of Noah, the three sons of Noah, right? And they use these things in racist constructs. In America, African Americans, I don't know where they got that concept from. So you hear the curse of Ham, right? What's called the curse of Ham. So they say, well, black people, Africans are supposed to be descendants of Ham. There's no truth to that. And because the Noah cursed Ham. And so there's that curse of Ham thing, right? That word. That's notion. And so in America, for instance, black Americans claim that, well, that Africans, black people are descendants of Ham. That's not true. That's inaccurate. That Noah cursed Ham, and so they're descendants, and so that's why they're slaves to white people. Every group has had slaves, right? Even Jewish people were slaves to Africans at one time. Yes, in fact, the Africans, black people, did rule the Egyptian civilization. Nubians, black people, the people who were called Ethiopia, that was part of the Egypt. They were black people until different times, right? So white Europeans did conquer them under Alexander the Great, and prior to that, so there was all that mixture. So there was a lot of mixture that went on in Egypt, right? So there was a lot of mixture in that civilization. So there's no credence to that Hamitic curse of Ham. But anyway, that's the name Semitic, right? The Semitic groups, that's how it came about, because people who are studying these language clusters in the Middle East, so these languages were related, but it doesn't mean they're necessarily genetically related. Culturally, the ascription, the attribution, nomenclature was supposed to define language, right? Language families and culture. Many times it's conflated and used to define race arbitrarily. Again, race is now, today, biologists view race as a social construct, right? It's not, there's no biological determinism, there's no real, it's a construct, there's no real distinction, configuration of what we call race. So, and the same thing for what came to be known as Aryan, right? Indo-European. So, interestingly, what's called the Indo-European. So Indo-European languages, right? That's the language uh, of Europeans, right, including the Germanic peoples, right, Europeans, and Central Asians, right, including Indians and whatnot, right. They're known in. They're supposed to be descendants of a Proto-Indo-European origin. It's supposed to have a Proto-European origin. That Proto-European origin is supposed to have come up from the area of modern day Iran or Armenia, and it moved into the area of known as Anatolia, that's Turkey. So you see that Turkey keeps coming up, it's very important, and Iran is very important. So the Proto-Indo-European language that became the ancestor of the European languages, right, in Central Asia, was supposed to have originated from the area of Iran, modern day Iran, right, and slash Armenia. That's Indo-European. But again, this has, and that's what the racist Nazis were also referring to, apart from the great civilization of the Achaemenids, right? Uh, but there's no racist affinity, right, with these studies of languages, right? Language and culture. It's just like my civilization, my language. I'm speaking in English. It's a European language, right? Uh, I'm speaking in English. It's and my civilization, my culture, the way I dress, right? The schools I'm attending. I'm an American citizen, but my race, it's a reflection of the language and culture that I've embraced, right? That I've used to identify myself, a form of identity, but it has nothing to do with my race, right? Racially, I'm not English, right? That's not my race. So I thought I'd stop this here, and I'll continue in a subsequent video regarding the ancient civilizations in the Middle East up to Iran, up to the Persians. My name is Osha, and I'll keep you posted. Thank you.